Welcome to the teaching ministry of Lakeside Alliance Church. We are a movement of people who are passionate about pursuing Jesus Christ. If you're in Southeast Wisconsin, join us on a Sunday morning and consider partnering in a mission that matters. For now, sit back and open your heart as we hear from God's Word.
Turn, if you would, to Genesis 50. Genesis 50, it's really great to be here with you this morning to continue to see this vision materialize and come together and expand and grow is a marvelous thing for me to watch and hear about. I'm excited for what God is doing already in and through Lakeside Alliance Church, and I know that He's just begun writing the story. I understand why they oriented the worship center this way. I mean, that is very distracting. And if I lose my train of thought while staring out that window, just bear with me. I'll figure it out eventually. But beautiful, absolutely beautiful. The story of Joseph is one that could be fit for the big screen. It's got everything. It's got sibling rivalry. It's got parental favoritism, deception, foul play, the possibility of retributive revenge. It's got a multicolored garment by Giorgio Armani. It's got it all. That's a marginal reading, but it's got it all. It's got it all. If you're not familiar with it, let me retell that story. Joseph is the second youngest of 12 sons born to Jacob. And he's the favorite son. And all the other brothers know it. Jacob, the patriarch, demonstrates this favoritism in an elaborate and lavish way by giving Joseph this extravagant gift of the Technicolor dream coat. That obviously pushes the brothers over the top. It incites their rage against him. And so they stage his death. They snatch him, they take his coat, they put animal's blood on it to make the father think, make Jacob think that Joseph had been gored by a wild animal, when in fact the brothers had taken Joseph to the border to sell him as a slave into the neighboring nation of Egypt. So he ends up hundreds of miles from home and endures a tumultuous time. Through a decade and a half in Egypt, he endures a tumultuous time, an absolute roller coaster, some positive things, a lot of really hard things. But through all that, ends up climbing the governmental ladder to the point where Joseph becomes second in command of this nation. And under his leadership, they stockpile enough resources to withstand a very severe famine that strikes the entire region. Meanwhile, his father and brothers back in Canaan didn't see the famine coming, and they are not prepared. They're ill prepared for this, but they catch wind of the fact that Egypt has some extra resources, some extra food, some extra water. And so he sends his sons to Egypt to to beg for food and water so that they'll be able to survive the rest of this famine. Well, who is it they end up before pleading their case? Joseph. Now, let's transport ourselves, engage the imagination. If you were one of the brothers, can you imagine what you would be feeling when you realize you're standing before the man you had sold into slavery, your own brother? You're standing before him. The man who now holds the power in his pinky finger to have you obliterated from the face of the planet. Imagine being Joseph. You have limitless power. They are at your mercy. You are replaying what they did to you. You can do to them as you see fit. How do you handle it? God's sovereignty sounds theoretical. When we talk about the sovereignty of God, we often imagine theologians tucked away in a closet somewhere talking about it. We don't often think about it having relevance to Main Street, to daily life. It doesn't seem practical. But it's actually God's sovereignty that Joseph applies to his situation. And by doing so, it enables forgiveness, restoration, grace, and love. So today, I want to take the sovereignty of God out of the closet of the theologians, and I want to bring it down into daily life and show you God's sovereignty in the trenches. Genesis 50, I want to read how this story ends. So the stage has been set. The brothers are before Joseph. Joseph has all the power. They have none of it. They're begging him. They're realizing who each other are now after this decade and a half. How does this unfold? We'll pick it up in verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Let me show you how God's sovereignty works out in the trenches. God's sovereignty, we're looking at three things today. God's sovereignty helps us guard against revenge, look for the good, and demonstrate God's grace. God's sovereignty is not theoretical. It is very practical. I'm going to show you how it's going to help you guard against revenge, look for the good, and demonstrate grace. First, God's sovereignty helps us guard against revenge. So Joseph's father has this message: your brothers are before you, forgive them. After all you've been through as Joseph, that seems like a tall order, does it not? Let's contextualize the story. Imagine one of your family members barging into your room in the middle of the night as you sleep, gagging you and bagging you, throwing you in the bed of a pickup truck, driving you down to the Mexico border, and selling you as a slave into one of the drug cartels, where you spend the next decade and a half. Okay? Contextualize. You got that? And now your father simply says to you, forgive them. Easier said than done, right? How do you begin to forgive that? How do you even begin to forgive that? The answer for Joseph, the answer for us, is the sovereignty of God. Look at verse 19. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" The original languages have ways of tipping off whether it's a yes or no answer to the question. So this answer is no. Am I in the place of God? Answer, no. Now, what does that mean? Am I in the place of God? What does it mean to put ourselves in the place of God? Well, there's a whole laundry list that we could come up with. One of the ways that we put ourselves in the place of God in situations like this is through omniscience. We know the attribute of omniscience, of knowing everything, belongs to God and God alone. But Joseph is saying, I don't have that. And you need to say to yourself, I don't have that. Now, what is it? How does that work out in a situation like this? Well, claiming to know what that person, what the brothers, the person who's hurt you, deserves to receive because of what they did. The problem with that is you don't know. You don't know what they deserve. You don't know how to execute this rightly. You have no idea what was going on in their minds or their lives at the time. You don't know what their circumstances were or what they were suffering from. So when I nurse a grudge, really what I'm doing is I'm claiming to know what that person should get as a punishment for what they've done to me. But the minute I've done that, I've put myself in the place of God. And putting myself in the place of God only fuels the grudge because we are lousy God substitutes. The Apostle Paul knew this, which is why he wrote in Romans 12, "Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord." What's he saying? He's saying, you're not God. I am. Stop trying to be me. So the sovereignty of God allows me to let this play out. The Lord will deal with this in a way that is just, right, and fair. Relax. Let God do this his way and in his time. So one of the ways that we put ourselves in the place of God is through omniscience, claiming to know exactly what that person or what those people should get for what they've done to me. Another way we put ourselves in the place of God is through unjustified righteous indignation. The statement is, how dare you do that to me? Do you know who I am? The sin nature in us always inflates our view of our value and our importance. We all struggle with an overinflated view of ourselves. We chronically think too highly of ourselves. And this is the reason why we struggle to handle hardship, adversity, suffering, injustice. Richard Baxter, writing in the 1600s, knew this. In a section where he's addressing this very issue, he writes this. He says, a proud person considers things as heinous or intolerable that are said or done against him. He that thinks lowly of himself sees things done or said against him as of little significance. He that magnifies himself sees offenses against him also magnified. In other words, Baxter is saying pride is going to make it impossible for you to handle being wronged. Pride is going to make it impossible for you to handle being wronged. Pride is just another way of saying, I've put myself in the place of God. This is why what led one pastor to conclude that the secret to a happy life is humility. The secret to a happy life is humility. Humility inoculates us against the injustices that others can perpetrate against us. It inoculates us from this bitterness that can develop in response to those sorts of things. By leaving the attribute of sovereignty exclusively in God's hands, Joseph is able to avoid revenge seeking. Miroslav Volf is from the Balkans. He lived through the Yugoslav wars. And those of you who studied history know about just how barbaric and graphic and awful all of that was. He had a front row seat to it. He's a theologian as well, and lost family members in the whole conflict. And he spent a lot of time reflecting on and writing on this subject. He writes this. He says, to triumph fully, evil needs two victories, not one. The first victory happens when an evil deed is perpetrated. The second victory when evil is returned. After the first victory, evil would die if the second victory did not infuse it with new life. Now, you can't just will yourself not to retaliate. You look at Volf's statement, and there's a lot of truth to that, but the hang-up with it is that it might just leave the next step in the ballpark of my own will. Our wills are not that good. They're not that powerful. We need something else to hold on to rather than just saying, I will not do this, I will not do this, I will not do this. I have to have a basis for that. And what does Joseph use? I have to refuse to put myself in the place of God. The sovereignty of God, again, allows me to let this play out. The Lord will deal with this in a way that is just, right, and fair. In fact, if I take matters into my own hands, what usually happens? You've lived long enough on this earth to know. You take matters into your own hands, what happens? It becomes a bigger mess. Relax. Let God do this his way and in his time. And one of the things we have to remember that for Joseph, it took a decade and a half for him to find out how God would use this. Western society, we want results now. We want things now. We want it fast. We want it resolved now. If we don't wake up tomorrow morning, it's not fixed. We have problems. It took a decade and a half for Joseph to see how God would work this out. Be patient. Be patient. So not only does God's sovereignty guard against revenge, it allows, second, for us to be on the lookout for what good he's going to do. Look at verse 20. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Verse 20, this verse is a gold mine. Mark it up, memorize it, put it on your refrigerator. There was a gal I got to know several years ago who had a very, very rough background. She ended up in the quote-unquote adult escort business, which is just an abusive world. And she was telling me all her story, but God had miraculously saved her. He had transformed her. And one of the things I was asking her is, well, how do you deal with all those years of that junk that you lived through? And she held out her arm, and on her forearm she had this verse tattooed. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. She said, this is the thing that gets me through every day. These people had sinister, evil intentions for me in my life. But I know, I can look back and I know that there was a good God who's still controlling all this, and he's writing my story. Verse 20 is a gold mine. If you can take verse 20 and rub it into your life, work it into your life, make it part of your daily thinking, you will find yourself equipped to handle almost anything in life. Verse 20 is a window into how God thinks. It's a window into how God thinks. Do you realize what a gem this is? How often when going through hardship or adversity do you find yourself asking the question, God, what are you doing? Well, you've got an answer here. When we ask that question, what do we want to know? We want to know what God's intentions are, his plans are, his purposes. Well, there you go. Verse 20. It shows you God's intentions, plans, and purposes for your life in suffering and adversity and in injustice. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. So verse 20 is trying to give us God's perspective. This is an incredible resource. It's an incredible resource. Wouldn't you love to see your life from God's perspective? From his perch, from where he sits. Verse 20 is testimony from above. It's testimony from God's perch. God sees things. He knows things we don't see and we don't know because we don't have his perspective. Verse 20 gives you a window into his perspective. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. I attended seminary in the Chicagoland area, and at that point I had never lived in a city that large before, and so there was quite a cultural adjustment to make, and one of those was navigating traffic in and around the city of Chicago. I remember hearing my first traffic report on the radio. Weather and traffic together on the 8s. Every 10 minutes these things are cranked out. And I remember hearing my first traffic report. I heard terms like Eden's Expressway, and I'm thinking to myself, well, what happened to interstate whatever, highway whatever? What happened to all this? Eden's Expressway, Bishop Ford Freeway. What's that? The Toohey Toll Plaza. No idea where that is. Stevenson Expressway, Lakeshore Drive, Tri-State Tollway. I heard numbers. I heard the terms inbound and outbound, not knowing what direction they're really referring to. It was a jumbled mess to me, right? And it's not as though they take their time and explain what all this means, right? It's rattled off like an auctioneer. Well, how do they get these traffic reports? I don't know how it's done today, but back in that time, they had people flying around in helicopters. In fact, some of the morning news shows, they would have a camera person up in the helicopter, and the people would be reporting visually into the station. Here's the traffic report. Helicopters are flying around. They're seeing it all. Now, I don't claim to be a media expert, but if they're doing it every 10 minutes in the radio, it's probably because people are demanding that. It's probably because this is good business. It's probably because they want this. The drivers want this. And they have people whose job it is to give these reports. Do the drivers take them seriously? Yes, they do. They take them very seriously. Why? Because their testimony comes from above. They see the whole picture. If you hear a report that says the Edens is jammed, but the Tri-State Tollway is clear, and you blow it off and take the Edens anyway, what happens? You don't get to work on time. You miss your kid's recital. Bad things happen when you don't take seriously the testimony from above. Verse 20 is God's sovereign testimony from above. And do you know what he's saying? When bad things happen, I'm up to good in your life. It doesn't matter what anybody has done to you. It doesn't matter how bad things get. I am up to good in your life. And Christian, I will always be up to good in your life. Do you realize what a resource that is? I want to put it strongly because this verse pushes us in this direction. Here's what this means for the believer. It means you are invincible. It means you're invincible. When you realize God is always up to good in your life, no matter how bad the bad is, there is always going to be hope. Always going to be hope. Sometimes it's good for us to be reminded of how this has worked out in the lives of other people. Christianity is continuing to grow in China, but sometimes we forget the price that was paid for that. I want to read you a letter. Dear ones, I long for a sight of your dear faces, but I fear we shall not meet on earth. I am preparing for the end very quietly and calmly. The Lord is wonderfully near, and he will not fail me. I was very restless and excited while there still seemed a chance in life, but God has taken away that feeling. And now I just pray for grace to meet the terrible end bravely. The pain will soon be over, and oh, the sweetness of the welcome above. My little baby will go with me. I think God will give it to me in heaven. And my dear mother will be so glad to see us. I cannot imagine the Savior's welcome. Oh, that will compensate for all these days of suspense. I do not regret coming to China, but I'm very sorry I've done so little. My married life, 2 precious years, have been so full of happiness. We will die together, my dear husband and I. Lizzie Atwood, a young pregnant woman, wrote this letter to her parents on August 3rd, 1900. 12 days later, Lizzie, her unborn baby, and 6 other missionaries were hacked to death by the guards. When Lizzie's parents, who were living in Oberlin, Ohio at the time, heard the news of the death of their daughter, their son-in-law, and unborn grandchild, in tears they said this: "We do not begrudge them. We gave them to that needy land. China will yet believe the truth." We do not begrudge them. And now it is estimated there are close to 300 million Christians in China. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. So when you're faced with the next bout of intense adversity or hardship or suffering, rather than getting bogged down with the question, why is this happening to me? Look for God's good and ask a different question. God, what good are you up to? God's sovereignty helps us guard against revenge. It helps us look for the good. And finally, it helps us demonstrate God's grace. Look at verse 21. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. If you're able to work God's sovereignty into your hardship, if you're able to take God's sovereignty and work it into your hardship, you're going to put to death thoughts of revenge. You're going to refocus on a different question. Rather than saying, God, why is this happening to me? You're going to say, God, what good are you up to? And that is going to set the stage for acting in ways that are gracious towards others. This is what Joseph does. His brothers are married. They have children. You've got families here, massive families. They end up moving from Canaan to Egypt, where Joseph provides them with homes and food and everything they need. He lavishes God's grace on them by affectionately meeting their practical everyday needs. So God's sovereignty makes us useful and productive in ministering to others, even those who have made us hurt us. I have seen this time and time again in ministry. When adversity cripples a person, they rarely remain engaged in church. They withdraw, they pull out of community, they stop attending Bible studies, they stop serving. I want you to notice the connection between Joseph's developed theology of God's sovereignty and his proactivity in ministry. The men who gagged and bagged him and sold him as a slave are there in front of him, and he has all the power. How in the world can he even entertain thoughts of showering them with grace? The answer, he has a developed theology of God's sovereignty. The sovereignty of God allows me to let this play out. The Lord is going to deal with this in his way. He's going to do it in a way that's just, right, and fair. He's going to take care of it. I don't have the necessary attributes to control it or to execute this in a way that turns out for good. So I need to take a step back, relax, and let God do this his way and in his time. And so where does the strength come to do all that? Because you might think, Pastor, you have no idea what that person did to me or what I'm going through. Where do I even start? Well, here's where we start, Christians. We start at the cross of Christ. We got to remember that the cross is something Joseph did not have. He did not have the resources of the cross, but he still resisted revenge. He still looked for the good. He still demonstrated tremendous grace to his brothers. You and I have the cross clearly in view. Therefore, we ought to be able to do what Joseph did even better than he did. When the infant church in Jerusalem was just getting started, Peter and John were interrogated. They were jailed for preaching the gospel. And upon their release, they went back to the believers and they prayed. Here's one of the things they declared in that prayer. Indeed, Herod and Pontius Pilate met together with the Gentiles and the people of Israel in this city to conspire against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed. They did what your power and will had decided beforehand should happen. Even though human agents are never off the hook for what they've done, the crucifixion and resurrection are ultimately a story God is writing. Look at it again. Herod, Pontius Pilate, Gentiles, people of Israel, conspiracy, kill Jesus. They did. All of that was what your power and will had decided beforehand should happen. The crucifixion and resurrection are ultimately a story that God is writing. He controls the pen. What you're going through now might feel like a crucifixion, but because we have the gospel, we know with certainty that a resurrection is coming. Resurrection, Christian, always has a last word. Why? Because that's how God writes the story. Nick Rickman tells the story of Dimitri. He's a pastor who was imprisoned for his faith. He served 17 years in a Soviet prison, 17 years, picture that, in a Soviet prison. How do you not just curl up in a ball in the corner of your jail cell and die with that? Well, Dimitri lived with a resurrection lens. Every morning, Dimitri stood by his bed with arms outstretched, and he sang his favorite worship hymn as loudly as he could. The other 1,500 hardened criminals mocked him and jeered him. After 15 years of thinking that all his family was dead, he first offered to sign and then refused to sign a confession. In his final act of defiance, he posted a page of Bible verses on a pillar. This ticked off the guards to no end. As the prison guards were leading him away to what appeared to be his execution, you know what happened? All 1,500 prisoners stood and sang his favorite worship hymn. The guards were stunned. They turned to him and said, "Who are you?" And Dimitri answered saying this. He said, "I am Jesus in your midst." They returned him to his cell. And soon afterward, he was released. How do you do that? He lived with a resurrection lens. Dimitri's resurrection lens gave him a new way of seeing. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. A resurrection lens frees us from evil's ability to cling to our souls. Some of you have got evil clinging to your soul. You've got it. You got to have a resurrection lens. It allows us to see rising where we might get stuck in dying. God has and is sovereignly writing this story, and while there are crucifixions along the way, Christian, there are crucifixions along the way. The Christian life is littered with them. There are crucifixions along the way. The story ends with, and it will always end with, a resurrection. Always. Why? Because that is the story God is writing, and the pen is in his hand.